I'm Jennifer with the Kentucky Agriculture and Environment in the Classroom, and this is our Apple Math Station, which is part of Feeding Kentucky, a STEM Adventure. So this station really helps kids understand the math involved in agriculture and why it's important in processing our food, selling our food, and how that all kind of works together. So we used apples here, and there are two different lessons. One is for our second and third graders, and then one is for our fourth and fifth graders. So this first activity is for our second and third graders. They don't need to know as much math to get these accomplished, but their first activity, and we're going to use these mats, and they're going to use the blue side, they're going to make a graph to interpret some data. And we are going to provide them some apples. And I have several different fake apples of different colors, and we're going to set a few of them out here, and it's their job to graph the apples based on color and size. And we've got one here for you. The kids can work in pairs. If you have a smaller group, they can each have a mat, but they're going to use their dry erase marker. We want to make sure they fill in the color at the bottom, either red or green. They're going to count the apples and then color up to that number on the chart. And then they're going to chart the size of the apples. So we have some larger apples and then some smaller apples, and then they can count those as well and do the same thing. This is where you can throw in some questions, some analysis questions, so we know that they understand the data that they have. You can ask, how many more red apples did you have than green apples? And they would count on their chart. So there's where my green apples ended. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 more red apples than green apples. And then you could ask, did you have more small or large apples? And depending on what you set out, we have our large apples coming up to the 7 mark. So we had more large apples there. So that's a fairly simple one. We just want to make sure that the kids understand how to make a graph to show data. The next part of this is a measurement activity. So we have a scale, we have a tape measure. We are going to have them measure around the fullest part of an apple, and actually added in a real apple here. You may or may not have one of those, but the larger apples are about the size of a real apple. So with our tape measure, they can take turns. We're going to first measure this apple in inches, and it has the inch measurement on one side. You can make sure that they have it on the right side. And we're going to make sure that when we come around, our measuring tape is going to hit the 0 mark and not the end of the tape. So this particular apple is about 9.5 inches around. You can use the word circumference with the third graders, but they may not know that yet. So why would that be important? Well, they actually grade apples based on size, and they sell apples that are of similar size together. So this is a grading machine that an engineer came up with. And it has these roller drums with different size holes. And the smaller apples will fall through first, and as the apples get bigger, it's going to take a bigger hole for them to fall through. And then they'll go down into the correct sorting bins. So this is a great example of engineering and math at work, and to help make a job more efficient. Now we can also weigh the apples. So we have a little kitchen scale here. And we want to make sure that it's on, and it's on the pounds and ounces unit. So I'm going to take my real apple, because I have one, and they can set it on the scale, and we're going to read the measurement of how many ounces our apple is, and they can write it in on their chart. So this apple is 6.8 ounces, or we can round it up to 7 ounces. They can compare that to one of our fake apples, which is only about 3 ounces. So obviously our real apple has a lot of water weight to it. That's why it weighs a lot more than the fake apple. You can also change the units, and you can do this when you're measuring them as well. You can flip your tape around. You can change this by hitting the unit button, and now it's on grams. So this is about 193 grams, and they can write that down as well. Their next task, if you have time, is they need to figure out how many apples it takes to make a pound. So if you're going to sell a pound of apples, how many apples would that be? They don't have to do an actual word problem here. They're actually going to add apples to the scale until they get to a pound. So we're going to make sure it's at 0. We're going to make sure that our units are back to pounds and ounces. And they're going to add the apples to the scale until they reach 1 pound. And you might want to choose apples that have a little weight to them. Some of these fake apples are really light, so we want to avoid those. So we find out it takes right at 5 of the fake apples to make 1 pound. There's another problem where they can do that. How many apples does it take to make 250 grams? We'll change it to grams real quick, and they can add the apples again. And it takes 3 apples to reach that 250 gram mark. So there's measurement and data. We're also graphing here, so this is a fun way to reinforce some of those things they've learned throughout the school year. Now for our 4th and 5th graders, we are going to flip the mat over, and they've got a little harder task. Their first job is they have to design a box that will hold 12 apples. So you can tell them that they're going to sell apples direct to the consumer from their farm, but they have to ship them in a box. If the box is too small, they're not going to get enough apples in there, but if it's too large, the apples are going to move around. It's going to cost more because a lot of the shipping companies base their fees on how big the box is. So we want to make it the minimum size that it can be to hold 12 apples. So hopefully our 4th and 5th graders are thinking about how they would go about doing that, but you may need to help them. So the hope is that they will get out 12 of these apples. They can work together, and they can put them in a configuration of 12. And there's a lot of different ways that they could do this. Because of our fact families, we know that we could have 3 rows of 4 apples, we could have 2 rows of 6 apples, or you could have one row of 12 apples if you want a really long skinny box. But they're going to have to set the apples in a way that they can then measure how much room they're going to need inside of a box. So we've done a 3x4 configuration, and if we start our tape measure over here, and it's past the apples on both sides, we're at about 13.5 inches wide. In this direction, we are looking at about 9.5 inches. And then the height would be, and you might want to make sure they're going to the tallest apple, it needs to be at least 3.5 inches tall. And they can write their measurements for their box right here. They can actually draw the configuration of their box in the space below, and then they can choose a different way that they could make the box. So we talked about the 2x6 and then a 1x12, or if they had a piece of cardboard in the middle, they could actually place a cardboard on 6 and then have 2 sets of 2x6 would be, or 2x3, which would be another configuration there. Their next task is to weigh 1 apple. So we're going to get our scale out again. We're going to make sure it's on pounds and ounces. You can use that real apple or one of the lighter fake apples. Just make sure it's, again, it has some weight to it. So our real apple weighs about 7 ounces. Then they have a word problem. How much will 12 apples weigh? So in 4th and 5th grade, they should know they're going to have to multiply the 7 ounces by 12, and they can come up with the answer. And I do provide a calculator to help them and to save time. So we're going to do 7 times 12. So that's 84 ounces, and You can also have them convert that to pounds, so we can divide by 16 because there's 16 ounces in a pound. So we're looking at 5¼ pounds. That's how many 12 apples will weigh. If you're using the fake apple, I actually have a different set of results for that, and that's on your instruction sheet. Then the next section, if they have time, they have a graph, and there are several questions, graph analysis questions, that they need to answer based on the data provided. And this particular graph is apple productions in pounds based on different apple types. So we've got Red, Golden Delicious, Granny Smith, and Fuji, and they have to answer the questions which are below, and the answers are provided to help you. Well, that's it for the Apple Math Station. There's a lot of learning going on here. It's a lot of practical math, and hopefully they will enjoy this lesson.